Jake Wilson stepped onto the rain-slicked sidewalk of Manhattan, the city's evening lights reflecting in shallow puddles like scattered stars. At 38, he was an architect with a reputation for designing sleek, modern buildings that seemed to defy gravity. His life, from the outside, looked like a blueprint of success. A thriving career, a brownstone in Chelsea shared with his wife, Emily, and their two kids, 14-year-old Sophie and 10-year-old Liam. But as he walked home, his polished leather shoes tapping a steady rhythm against the pavement, a quiet unease gnawed at him. Something was off. It had been for months. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of street vendors' pretzels and exhaust. Jake adjusted his scarf, his breath visible in the early autumn chill. His mind churned, replaying the small details that had started to pile up like bricks in an unstable wall. Emily, his wife of 15 years, had changed. Her late nights at the advertising firm where she worked had become more frequent, always explained away with a casual, client meetings ran long. Her phone buzzed constantly, but she'd tilt the screen away or slip it into her pocket with a practiced smile. Once, when he'd asked about a new perfume he didn't recognize, she'd laughed it off, saying a colleague had gifted it to her. But the scent lingered in his mind, sharp and unfamiliar, like a warning. Jake wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. He prided himself on his logic, his ability to see the structure beneath chaos. But even he couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. Dinners at home had become quiet, mechanical affairs. Sophie would scroll through her phone, barely speaking, while Liam asked questions about school projects that Emily answered distractedly. The warmth that once filled their home, movie nights on the couch, spontaneous dance parties in the kitchen, had faded, replaced by a silence that felt heavier each day. Tonight, though, something had shifted. As Jake crossed 7th Avenue, his hand brushed against a crumpled receipt in his coat pocket. He'd found it the night before, tucked inside Emily's handbag while looking for her keys. It was from a boutique hotel in Midtown, dated 2 weeks ago, with a charge for a room she'd never mentioned. Emily wasn't the type to splurge on solo getaways, and they hadn't taken a trip together in months. The receipt felt like a puzzle piece that didn't fit, and it had kept him up half the night, staring at the ceiling while Emily slept soundly beside him. He slowed his pace as he approached their brownstone, its warm lights spilling onto the street. The walk wasn't about clearing his head. It was about preparing for what might come next. Jake had always been good at reading plans, anticipating how structures would hold or collapse under pressure. But this wasn't a building. It was his life. And the cracks were starting to show. Inside, the house was quiet, save for the faint hum of the TV in the living room. Sophie was sprawled on the couch, earbuds in, her face lit by the glow of her phone. Liam was at the kitchen table, surrounded by colored pencils and a half-finished science project. Emily wasn't there. Jake's stomach tightened as he set his keys on the counter, the metallic clink louder than it should have been. "Hey, Soph," he called softly. "Where's Mom?" Sophie pulled out one earbud, barely looking up. She texted, said she's stuck at work. Again, her tone carried a hint of annoyance, or maybe suspicion. Jake couldn't tell. Kids pick up on things, he thought, even when they don't say it out loud. He nodded, forcing a smile. "Right. You guys eat yet?" Liam made a sandwich, Sophie said, already turning back to her phone. "I'm good." Jake glanced at Liam, who was focused on gluing a model rocket together. The kid was meticulous, just like his dad. "Looks good, buddy," Jake said, ruffling his son's hair. Liam grinned, but didn't look up. For a moment, the normalcy of it all, the kids, the house, the routine, felt like a lifeline. But the receipt in his pocket burned against his chest, pulling him back to reality. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom, his footsteps heavy. Emily's side of the closet was neatly organized, her dresses and blouses hanging in perfect rows. But something caught his eye, a small, unfamiliar jewelry box tucked behind a stack of scarves. He hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet, one he'd never seen her wear. No note, no tag, just a bracelet gleaming under the closet light. It wasn't a gift from him, and their anniversary was months away. His pulse quickened, but he closed the box and put it back, his mind racing. Downstairs, his phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, the wife of his best friend, Nick. "Jake, we need to talk. It's important. Can we meet tomorrow?" The words hit like a punch. Nick and Sarah had been part of their lives for years. Barbecues in their backyard, game nights, the kids playing together. Sarah's tone, even through text, felt urgent, raw. Jake's fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing a single word. When? As he stood there, staring at the screen, the front door clicked open. Emily's voice floated in, cheerful but strained. "I'm home. Sorry, crazy day." Jake slipped his phone into his pocket and took a deep breath. Whatever Sarah had to tell him, whatever truth was waiting, he'd face it. But for now, he'd play the part, calm, steady, the man who held everything together. Because if the foundation of his life was about to crumble, he needed to be ready to rebuild. The next morning, Jake sat in a quiet Brooklyn cafe, the kind tucked away on a side street where the noise of the city felt like a distant hum. The air smelled of roasted coffee and fresh pastries, but the warmth of the place did little to ease the knot in his chest. He stirred his black coffee absent-mindedly, his eyes fixed on the door. Sarah's text from last night echoed in his mind. "We need to talk. It's important." The words carried a weight he couldn't shake, and the receipt from the Midtown Hotel, still crumpled in his coat pocket, felt heavier than ever. Sarah walked in at exactly 10 a.m., her face pale and her eyes shadowed from what Jake guessed were sleepless nights. She wore a navy sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, as if she hadn't had the energy to care about appearances. She spotted him, gave a small, tired wave, and slid into the seat across from him. For a moment, neither spoke. The clink of cups and the murmur of other patrons filled the silence, but it felt like they were the only two people in the room. "Jake," Sarah started, her voice low, almost a whisper. She gripped her hands together, knuckles white. "I don't know how to say this, so I'm just going to say it. It's about Emily and Nick." Her eyes met his, and the raw pain in them told him everything before she even continued. Jake's heart thudded, but he stayed still, his face a mask of calm. He'd spent years designing buildings to withstand storms. Now he had to hold himself together. Sarah took a shaky breath. "They've been seeing each other. For months, I think. I found out a couple of weeks ago." Her voice cracked, and she looked down at the table, as if the words were too heavy to hold his gaze. "I didn't want to believe it at first. Nick's been my husband for 12 years, Jake. We have a daughter. You and Emily, your family to us. But I saw them." Jake's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. He needed to hear it all, every detail, no matter how much it hurt. Sarah went on, her words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in too long. She described how Nick had been acting strange, late nights, vague excuses about work trips, a new cologne that didn't match anything she'd bought him. Then, one evening, driven by a gut feeling, she'd followed him. She saw him meet Emily outside a boutique hotel in Midtown, the same one from the receipt in Jake's pocket. They'd walked in together, too close, too familiar, disappearing into the lobby. "I didn't confront him," Sarah said, her voice steadying as she spoke. "I couldn't. Not then. I needed proof, something solid, so I started paying attention. I found texts on his phone. Not many, they're careful, but enough. They've been meeting in secret, using work as a cover." She pulled out her phone and slid it across the table. Screenshots of messages glowed on the screen. Short, cryptic exchanges between Nick and Emily, mentioning times and places. One read, "Meet me at 7. Same spot. Miss you." Jake's stomach churned, but he forced himself to look, to let the truth sink in. "Why tell me now?" he asked, his voice low but steady. He wasn't angry. Not yet. It was like he was studying a blueprint, trying to understand where the structure had failed. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. "Because you don't deserve this, Jake. Neither of us do. I couldn't keep it from you. You're not just Nick's friend. You're like a brother to him. To us. I thought, maybe if we face this together, it'll hurt less." She paused, wiping her eyes. "I'm so sorry." Jake reached across the table and squeezed her hand, a small gesture to steady them both. "Thank you," he said simply. He didn't need to say more. The gratitude was real. Sarah had ripped the veil off a truth he'd been avoiding, and though it stung, it was better than living a lie. They spent the next hour talking, piecing together the timeline. Emily's late nights aligned with Nick's business trips. The hotel receipt matched a date Sarah had marked in her notes. They didn't dig into anything illegal. No hacking phones or hiring investigators. But they shared what they knew, building a picture neither could deny. Jake felt the betrayal like a physical weight, not just from Emily, but from Nick, the guy who'd stood by him at his wedding, who'd coached Liam's soccer team, who'd shared beers and laughed about life's chaos. The double betrayal cut deeper than he'd expected. As they left the cafe, Sarah hesitated at the door. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked out at the Brooklyn street, where people rushed by, oblivious to the storm in his world. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I need to know everything before I decide. Can we keep talking? Share what we find?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah, I don't want to do this alone, either." They parted ways, but the conversation lingered. Jake walked back toward Manhattan, his mind racing. He didn't want to confront Emily yet. Not until he was sure. Not until he could face her without breaking. But the bracelet in her closet, the receipt, Sarah's words, it all pointed to a truth he couldn't ignore. He thought of Sophie and Liam, their faces at dinner, the way they sensed something was wrong without knowing why. Whatever came next, he'd protect them. And he'd protect himself. Back at the office, he sat at his desk, staring at a half-finished skyscraper design. The clean lines and sturdy foundations mocked him. He pulled out his phone and texted Sarah, "Let me know if you find anything else." "I'll do the same." Then he leaned back, closing his eyes, steeling himself for the moment he'd walk through his front door again, knowing the life he'd built was already starting to collapse. Jake stood outside his Chelsea brownstone, the evening air cool against his skin. The city buzzed around him, taxis honking, a distant siren wailing, but inside him, everything was still. The weight of Sarah's words from the cafe, the hotel receipt, the cryptic texts, and the silver bracelet in Emily's closet had solidified into a truth he could no longer dodge. Tonight, he'd face it. His hand rested on the doorknob, cold and unyielding, as he took a deep breath. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about clarity, about ending the charade that had been eating away at him for months. He stepped inside, the familiar creak of the door louder than usual in the quiet house. The living room was dimly lit, the TV off for once. Sophie was upstairs, probably lost in her music, and Liam's science project still cluttered the kitchen table, but he was nowhere in sight. Emily sat at the dining table, her hands clasped tightly, fingers twisting a napkin into knots. She looked up as Jake entered, her eyes flickering with something, guilt, maybe, or fear. She didn't smile, didn't offer her usual breezy greeting. The air between them was thick, heavy with unspoken truths. Jake set his keys on the counter with a deliberate clink, hung his coat over a chair, and turned to face her. He didn't sit. Standing, arms crossed, he let the silence stretch, his gaze steady. Emily shifted in her seat, her shoulders hunching as if trying to shrink away from his eyes. He didn't need to ask. She knew why he was looking at her like that. The calm in his posture wasn't weakness. It was the resolve of a man who'd already grieved the loss of what they'd had, who'd spent nights piecing together the betrayal until it was undeniable. "Jake," Emily started, her voice barely above a whisper. She stopped, swallowing hard, her eyes darting to the table. "You're home early." He didn't respond, just watched her, giving her the space to fill the silence. He'd learned from years of designing buildings that sometimes the strongest structures were the ones that held steady under pressure, waiting for the right moment to reveal their strength. This was that moment. Emily's hands trembled as she pushed the napkin aside. "Okay," she said, her voice cracking. "I know you've been noticing things. I haven't been honest." She looked up, her eyes glistening, but Jake's expression didn't waver. "It's Nick," she said finally, the words tumbling out like a confession she'd rehearsed but couldn't perfect. "It started a few months ago. I didn't mean for it to happen, Jake. It was a mistake, I swear. I was confused, stressed, and he was there. I'm so sorry." The words hit like a slow, dull ache, not because they were surprise, but because hearing them aloud made the betrayal real. Jake had imagined this moment 100 times, played out every scenario in the sleepless hours of the night. He'd pictured himself shouting, demanding answers, or crumbling under the weight of it. But now, standing here, he felt none of that. Just a quiet, bitter acceptance. He'd already mourned their marriage. This was just the final nail. "Why?" he asked, his voice low, steady. Not accusatory, just curious, like he was trying to understand a design flaw. "Why him? Why now?" Emily's face crumpled, tears spilling over. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head. "It wasn't planned. We were working on a project together, late nights, and it just happened. I tried to stop it, Jake. I did. I love you. I love the kids. I didn't want to hurt you." He nodded slowly, letting her words hang in the air. They sounded hollow, like lines from a script she didn't believe herself. He thought of Sarah, her pain mirroring his own, and the screenshot she'd shown him. Meet me at 7. Same spot. Miss you. He thought of Nick, his best friend, who'd sat across from him at countless dinners, laughing, toasting to their friendship. The double betrayal stung, but Jake kept his focus on Emily. This was about her choices, her lies. You don't have to explain, he said finally, his tone even. I already know. I've known for a while. Her eyes widened, a mix of shock and shame. I found a receipt. I talked to Sarah. She saw you with him. At the hotel. Emily's breath hitched, her hands flying to her face. Oh God, Jake, I'm so sorry, she sobbed. I didn't want this. I didn't want to lose us. But Jake just shook his head. You already did, he said quietly. Not tonight. Months ago, when you chose to lie. When you chose him. He paused, letting the words sink in. I packed a bag. It's been ready for days. I'm leaving Emily. Not because I want to, but because I have to. For me. For Sophie and Liam. Her sobs grew louder, but Jake didn't move to comfort her. He couldn't. The man who'd once held her through every storm was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned to protect himself. He turned toward the stairs, then stopped, glancing back. You should tell the kids the truth. They deserve that much. Don't make them guess. He climbed the stairs to their bedroom, his steps measured, deliberate. The suitcase was under the bed, packed with essentials, clothes, toiletries, a few photos of Sophie and Liam. He'd known this day was coming, had felt it in his bones. As he zipped the bag shut, he heard Emily's muffled crying downstairs, but it didn't pull him back. The wound she'd opened had already scarred over, toughened by weeks of silent preparation. When he came back down, Emily was still at the table, her face buried in her hands. He didn't say goodbye. There was nothing left to say. He grabbed his coat, slung the suitcase over his shoulder, and walked out into the Manhattan night. The city lights blurred as he moved, not because of tears, but because he was already looking ahead, toward a future he couldn't yet see, but knew he'd build. Step by step, just like he always had. Jake's new apartment in Brooklyn was small, a one-bedroom walk-up with creaky floors and a view of a brick wall, but it felt like a fresh start. The Manhattan brownstone, with its memories of Emily's laughter and the kids' footsteps, was behind him now. He'd been gone for 3 weeks, and though the ache of betrayal still lingered, it was dulled by the rhythm of his new routine. Mornings were spent sketching designs at a nearby coffee shop, afternoons at the architecture firm, and evenings texting Sarah, whose messages had become a quiet anchor in the storm. Sarah, too, was navigating her own unraveling life. Her park slope home, once filled with Nick's loud laughter and their daughter Ava's chatter, now felt like a museum of a past she couldn't reclaim. She and Jake had started talking daily, at first to share updates about Emily and Nick's affair, small details, like a sighting at a restaurant or a vague text Nick sent, pleading for forgiveness. But their conversations had shifted, growing deeper, more personal. They talked about their kids, their dreams, the cracks in their lives they'd ignored for too long. Sarah confessed she'd always wanted to open a cafe, a cozy place with homemade scones and local art. Jake shared his vision for a community center he was designing pro bono, a space for kids like Liam to explore their passions. In their shared pain, they found a thread of understanding, fragile but real. One chilly October evening, they met at a diner on Atlantic Avenue, the kind with sticky vinyl booths and neon signs that flickered. Sarah wore a green scarf, her eyes brighter than they'd been in the cafe weeks ago. Jake noticed the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear when she laughed, a small gesture that made his chest feel lighter. They ordered milkshakes, chocolate for her, vanilla for him, and talked for hours, the conversation flowing from their kids' quirks to old movies they loved. For the first time in months, Jake felt like himself, not the man carrying the weight of betrayal, but someone who could still find joy in a moment. You know, Sarah said, stirring her milkshake with a straw, I didn't think I'd laugh like this again. Not after everything. Her voice softened, but her smile held. Jake nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. Yeah, I didn't either. But it's like we're allowed to, you know? We didn't break this. They did. Sarah's eyes met his, and for a moment, the diner faded away. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something honest, something neither had felt in a long time. They didn't rush it, didn't need to label it. They just let it be, a quiet promise that life could still surprise them. Meanwhile, Emily was unraveling. The Chelsea brownstone, once a home, now felt like a cage of her own making. Sophie and Liam, who split their time between her and Jake, were distant. Sophie barely spoke, retreating to her room with her earbuds, her silence louder than any argument. Liam was worse. His confusion spilled out in bursts of anger, slamming doors, or quiet moments when he'd ask, "Why did you do it, Mom?" Emily had no answers that didn't sound hollow. She tried to fill the void with gestures, cooking Liam's favorite mac and cheese, suggesting a trip to the zoo. But the kids saw through it. The warmth they'd once shared was gone, replaced by an invisible wall she couldn't breach. One night, while cleaning Liam's room, Emily found a drawing tucked under his pillow. It was a crayon sketch of their old family: Jake, Emily, Sophie, and Liam, smiling under a bright sun. At the bottom, in Liam's uneven scrawl, were the words, "I want us back." Emily sank onto the bed, clutching the paper, tears blurring the colors. The weight of what she'd done crashed over her. Not just the affair, but the trust she'd shattered, the family she'd fractured. She thought she could hold on to Nick, that their stolen moments meant something, but even that was crumbling. She met Nick at a quiet midtown cafe, hoping to salvage something from the wreckage. He looked worn, his usual charm dulled by the reality of their choices. "We can't keep this up, Nick," Emily said, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. It was a mistake. It cost me everything." Nick nodded, his eyes on his coffee cup. "I know," he said quietly. "I lost Sarah. Ava barely looks at me. It wasn't worth it." There was no fight, no pleading, just the resigned truth that their affair had been a fleeting escape, not a future. Back in Brooklyn, Jake and Sarah's connection grew stronger. They took Ava, Sophie, and Liam to a street fair one weekend, the kids laughing as they tossed rings at bottles and shared cotton candy. Jake caught Sarah's eye as Liam high-fived Ava, and they shared a smile, small but real. It wasn't about replacing what they'd lost. It was about building something new, piece by piece. Jake felt the stirrings of hope, not just for himself, but for the kids, for Sarah, for a life that could be whole again. Emily, alone in the brownstone, sat at the dining table where she'd confessed to Jake. The house was silent, the absence of her family a constant reminder of her choices. She opened a drawer, pulling out the divorce papers she hadn't yet signed. The weight of Liam's drawing, still folded in her pocket, pressed against her. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but for the first time, she wondered if she could still change the future. Not for Jake, but for her kids, for herself. The late autumn sun cast golden streaks across Central Park, where the leaves had turned a fiery mix of red and orange. Jake walked along a winding path, his hand brushing against Sarah's as they watched Sophie, Liam, and Ava race ahead, chasing each other through piles of fallen leaves. Laughter echoed, a sound Jake hadn't realized he'd missed so much. It had been 6 months since he'd left the Chelsea brownstone, 6 months since Emily's confession had shattered the life he'd known. But here, in the crisp November air, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Sarah's presence beside him was steady, grounding. Their connection, born from shared pain, had grown into something deeper, quiet, unspoken, but undeniable. They hadn't rushed into anything, hadn't needed to. Their days were filled with small moments: coffee runs in Brooklyn, late-night texts about their kids, or shared glances when Liam and Ava teamed up to tease Sophie. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building something new, something honest. Jake caught Sarah's eye as she laughed at Liam's attempt to stuff leaves down Ava's jacket, and he smiled. For the first time, he could imagine a future that didn't hurt. Across town, Emily sat alone in the brownstone, the divorce papers now signed and tucked away in a drawer. The house, once alive with the chaos of family life, was now a hollow shell. Sophie and Liam spent half their time with Jake, and their visits with her were strained, marked by polite distance. Sophie answered in monosyllables, her eyes fixed on her phone, while Liam's questions, "Why did you do it, Mom?" still echoed in Emily's mind. She tried to rebuild their trust, cooking their favorite meals, suggesting outings to the Museum of Natural History, but it felt forced, like trying to glue together a broken vase with pieces missing. One evening, while sorting through old photos, Emily found a picture from Liam's 8th birthday, Jake grilling in the backyard, Sophie blowing out candles, Emily's arm around them both. The memory stung, not because of what she'd lost with Jake, but because of what she'd taken from her kids. She'd met Nick one last time, weeks ago, in that same Midtown cafe. The conversation was brief, final. "We were wrong," she'd said, her voice steady. This wasn't love. It was an escape. Nick had nodded, his face etched with regret. "I lost everything for nothing," he'd muttered before leaving. They hadn't spoken since. Emily's reckoning came unexpectedly on a quiet Saturday afternoon. She was walking through Central Park, hoping the fresh air might clear her head, when she saw them. Jake, Sarah, Sophie, Liam, and Ava. They were near the Bethesda fountain, the kids tossing a frisbee while Jake and Sarah sat on a bench, their shoulders touching, their laughter soft but genuine. Emily froze, her breath catching. It wasn't just that Jake had moved on. It was the way he looked at Sarah, the way the kids smiled, unguarded, happy. It was a family, not hers anymore, but real, rebuilt from the ashes she'd left behind. She stood there, hidden by a cluster of trees, unable to look away. Sophie's laugh, bright and free, was a sound Emily hadn't heard in months. Liam ran to Jake, showing him a leaf shaped like a star, and Jake ruffled his hair the same way he always had. Sarah leaned into Jake, her hand resting lightly on his arm, and there was no guilt in their closeness, no secrecy. It was simple, true, the kind of love Emily realized she'd stopped giving Jake long before Nick came along. The weight of it hit her like a wave. She'd made choices, selfish, reckless ones, and now she was living with the consequences. Not just the divorce, not just the empty house, but the loss of her children's trust, the absence of their warmth. She thought of Liam's drawing, still folded in her purse. "I want us back." She'd clung to it, hoping she could fix things, but seeing them now, she understood. You can't rebuild trust with good intentions alone. It takes time, consistency, action she might never get the chance to prove. Emily turned away, her eyes stinging, and walked back toward the park's exit. She didn't cry, not yet. The tears would come later, in the silence of the brownstone. But for now, she let the truth settle. She'd chosen a fleeting distraction over her family, and now she had to live with that choice. But there was a flicker of resolve in her, a determination to try, not for Jake, but for Sophie and Liam. Maybe one day, they'd see her as their mother again, not the woman who'd broken their home. Back in the park, Jake and Sarah gathered the kids, heading toward a hot dog stand. Liam tugged at Jake's sleeve, asking for extra mustard, while Sophie and Ava debated whether to get ice cream instead. Jake glanced at Sarah, her face lit by the setting sun, and felt a quiet certainty. This wasn't the life he'd planned, but it was the one he was building, step by step, with people who chose honesty over lies. As they walked away, the park humming with life around them, Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah, sent just as she stood beside him. "Thanks for today. It feels like home." He looked at her, her smile soft and real, and typed back, "It does." The kids ran ahead, their laughter carrying on the breeze. And Jake knew, no matter what came next, they'd face it together.